Computer recording. Good morning, everyone, or good evening to those of you in the UK. Thank you all for being here. My name is Beth Barrett. I'm the artistic director at SIFF, and it's so very exciting to have you all here for a Q&A for The Reason I Jump. We're lucky to have Seattle-based James Longley to lead our discussion with Jerry Rothwell, Nainita Desai, and Nick Ryan. I'll let James take it away from here. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of the meeting, and to pepper you with questions about the film, about The Reason I Jump. And I guess I'd like to start with just sort of asking Jerry, how did you come across this story, this book actually, and how you developed it into a film, I guess. What's the process by which this movie came into existence?
It was. I mean, so I think I first encountered the book through two of the producers, Stevie and Jeremy, who you see in the film, who are parents of Joss, who's one of the people in the film, and they'd found the book, I think, when Joss was relatively young, and it sort of transformed the way they understood him, I guess, and they wanted to share that in the film, and they were film producers, and then through my producer Al Morrow, they connected up with me.
But if you could just explain a little bit about the book itself, maybe. And,
yeah, so the book is 58 questions about autism, with answers written by a 12-year-old Japanese boy who's non-speaking, who writes by pointing to letters on a letterboard, or actually also he now just types independently at a computer. But it takes him a long time to write each sentence, and the book, the answers are kind of poetic, mostly sensory, about his internal world and the sense he's also trying to make of the neurotypical world. I guess the first thing I thought, in a rather unimaginative way, sorry, that's my son. The first thing I thought in a rather unimaginative way was, it would be a film about Naoki finding his voice, this young boy who then has become a writer. He's written maybe 8 or 10 books now, I think. And so I went to see him. Partly also I wanted to meet with him, talk with him about the project, initiate that process as you do. He was very kind of happy for the project to go forward, and meeting him was a kind of extraordinary experience. Just to see him write and to answer him questions, and at the same time to kind of understand the kind of distractions, the physical non-speaking autistic behavior.
How did it come about? I mean, did you approach him and tell him about that you wanted to make a film, and what was his reaction?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he was very happy about that. But his one rule was, I don't want to be in the film. So that really is the moment that sort of sets the film off on a different kind of trajectory, and probably a more interesting, adventurous one, which is how do we use this text to enable an audience to kind of sit alongside different non-speaking autistic people around the world for a period of time, and maybe see the world through different eyes. And
in the film, he's played by a young boy who is sort of the narrator figure of the film. And how did you come to this idea?
So I guess I then sort of went down this route of, okay, the film is going to portray different non-speaking autistic people around the world, but the danger of that, from a filmmaking point of view, was that they became like case studies of the text, or the text was used to, just applied to their experience when their experience might be completely different. So I felt the film needed a space outside of the documentary elements, and I met this young non-speaking autistic Japanese boy in the UK. I felt that he could play a role which was a bit like Naoki at the age that he wrote the book. So it would have you thinking all the time about childhood as well as about autism and about Naoki, but also maybe he's not literally Naoki. He's kind of, you know, David Mitchell, who translated the book, described it as like an envoy from his son's world. And I think of that character as a bit like the envoy, you know, sort of representing the book. And so basically we sort of shot with him a kind of journey, you know, journey from the coast to home, or from night to day to night. You know.
What was the sequence of events? I mean, did you come up with that idea and do that simultaneously with the filming of the individual participants in the film, or?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, I had filmed, you know, because Joss was the son of the producers, and because he's in the UK, I'd filmed with Joss over a couple of years, actually, you know, different moments, and the film includes some of his parents' footage of him as well. So I'd begun to film, but then really, you know, I was working with Vulcan in Seattle, who I know you know well. In fact, I think that's where we first met, right when I was at the beginning of this process.
That's right, yes.
And I was probably very confused at that time.
You seemed really grounded.
Okay, it's all bluff. But yeah, so yes, those two things came together. I mean, I think what I knew was, okay, we need, because it's very observational, the documentary side of it. You know, there wasn't a case of anything kind of in the documentary side scripting. It was very much going with what people were doing and where they were on the day, I think, because of the nature of the subject matter. So it was a mixture of that with the sense that we could go on this journey with this young boy and shoot that.
And so I want to bring in also the people responsible for a lot of the sound in the movie. How did Jerry approach you, and what did he tell you about the film, and what he wanted to do with it?
So I got brought in, compared to most in terms of process, I tend to be brought in not rather late in the day, but in this project I was brought in very, very early on. Jerry had been editing for a little while, but that was interspersed with still filming that was carrying on. So Jerry wanted me, I guess the kind of brief you could say was to create this cinematic, immersive, oral experience to represent the world of Naoki and his writings. And we wanted to blur the lines between music and sound design because of the experiential side and this immersive side, and how Naoki and the contributors and the characters experience the world around them. We wanted to help bring that across to the audience in a very personal and immersive way. So, and also Jerry, I think I remember Jerry's first question was, have you ever worked with found sound? And I have, because my background is I used to be a sound designer on feature films, and then I broke away and became a composer. So where the sound design, I think, represents, in some respects, represents the abstract representation of Naoki's writings, the music which I composed represents the emotional state of being and gives the characters an internal voice. And so, you know, compared to most scores where everything's very planned and organized, we came in with, we devised various parameters and concepts based around Naoki's writings to try and mirror that in through the music and the sound. And so there were sort of abstract concepts like the way that one of the characters perceives the detail in objects before seeing the whole picture unfold before them. And so I would create pieces, experimental pieces throughout the edit without seeing any of the visuals, that were based on these random broken musical elements that then formed a whole picture, as though it was like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together. And another key parameter, key aspect, was giving the characters who are non-speaking a voice, a musical voice that represented their internal voice. So I took key phrases from the book, David Mitchell's book, translated them back into the original Japanese phrases like "we are outside the flow of time" or "beautiful circle," that have this, existential, this meaning in the book, and broke them down into their consonants and syllables and vowels, and then deconstructed them and reconstructed them, and recorded the voice, and layered them and treated them so that it would affect the audience in a very subliminal way. And there are a couple of cues in the film where Ben, I think, is using the letterboarding system and I actually mouth and sing those words as they come up on screen, as they type on screen. So the verbal element was quite fun and interesting. And then I gave some of the characters. We wanted to try and create different sound worlds for each character and give them a different instrument. So Ben and Emma became the double bass, and the guitar became their sound, and Joss inhabits the world of the cello, which you hear, for example, when he's cupping his ears. And I love that interaction with, I think Nick or Jerry came up with that in the dub, in the mix, where you're really experiencing Nick's.
Right. I was going to ask about that. Yeah. How you came up with that.
Yeah. And
that idea of having the idea of having the subjective sound where he puts his hand on one side and that side goes, and so suddenly you're in his head, really hearing it and experiencing it from his point of view, which I think is really beautiful. And there are not that many films that do it in such a nice way. Prophet, for example, is an example where his hearing, in the middle of a scene, his hearing goes out and you hear it in the way that he hears it. But this was just done in a really, really beautiful way that I didn't even, the first time I watched it, I almost didn't notice it, but then I was like, wow, this is like really everything. And I wanted to ask actually, because Nick, maybe we could bring you into the discussion as well, and just talk about maybe a specific part of maybe if we just asked all of you like how you worked on like specific parts of the film. For example, Joss's green box sequence, the humming of the green boxes, which goes into a long kind of sequence of experiencing this sound, and then to the narrator, boy, and these pylons, and all of this, and sort of starting with, does it begin with the idea of the sound, or is it?
Yeah, Nick, you can talk about the microphone.
Yeah, so this is particular to one of our characters, Joss, and he is very interested in the noise that green boxes make, and like a lot of autistic people, the sound of things can be very disturbing, can be very intriguing, and there is a sense, I think, his mum has spoken to me about the fact that he sort of has a sense that he can hear frequencies from a very, very long way away from these green boxes, and he spends a lot of time with his ear pressed up against the boxes. Just to explain, in the UK, on the side of roads, we have these junction boxes, and they tend to be, they contain telephone equipment, so they're sort of like local substations. And you see one of these in the film. The one in the film, the first one is actually an electricity substation, but then you also see these smaller boxes. And this was a real opportunity to, I guess, sort of show that the audience could hear things that Joss can hear, that they wouldn't ordinarily hear. So there's a sort of extra sensory.
Right, you're taking. It feels like you're taking this sound that we've all experienced going past these humming boxes, and made it kind of hyper real and sort of
in order to capture this
enveloping, as if you put a microphone inside of it or something. And now we're sort of on a microbial level experiencing the world of this green box sound. It's really magnificent.
He did. Nick built microphones to sit on the box.
An electromagnetic induction microphone in order to capture the electromagnetic radiation that these boxes are emitting. And I went around and captured all the sound, and the kind of process of doing that was very interesting, because of course one of the most important things, I think, from a sound designer's point of view, is to remember that whilst we're, and this is something that Jerry reminded me of very early on, is that whilst we are immersing the listener in the so-called world of an autistic person, and those worlds are very different for each individual autistic person, we are not simulating that experience, because that's impossible. But the impossibility of simulation is something that exists in any form of storytelling. You can't get inside my head, I can't get inside your head. And so we tend to use language to arrive at a form of consensus as individuals to explain our experiences. But actually the beauty of sound is that you can actually inhabit the experience itself. So rather than kind of seeing, you're being, as it were. So you're able to position the audience member in the first-hand experience. In this case, the experience can only be a metaphor, but it is a sensory metaphor rather than a linguistic one. And it's therefore much more immersive and immediate and visceral. And so, but the process of capturing these sounds with a microphone that we built specially was a really nice kind of symbol of that, that impossibility of understanding another person, and the way that you need to actually create some form of instrumentation, whether that's filmmaking or whether that's actually a device that captures different frequencies that are inaudible.
Yeah, I really think one of the wonderful things about the movie is the way it invites the audience to imagine someone else's perception, even if you get it wrong, even if it's not the way someone else imagines things or perceives things exactly. Nonetheless, the act of trying to imagine it is maybe a kind of the subtlest form of empathy, if you like. And
I think that one of the things that is very clear, whether the metaphors that we used are synonymous with the experiences of the people in the film, what is clear is this amplification of sensory experience that is common to all the people we meet, the kind of sensitivity to light and sound and motion and all the sensory information that surrounds us, which I think many neurotypical people tend to pass by and sort of are able to filter out in a way that an autistic person is not.
And in that scene, how did you, because it feels to me like it's a combination of your sound design also with Nainita, your music as well, if I'm not wrong. Mm-hmm. And how do you are you during the process, were you working together designing the scenes? I mean, how planned out in advance was it, or how did that work?
I think it emerged, and actually, you know, it was a four-way kind of process between Nainita and myself, Jerry, and the editor. So we were all kind of. That's a really good example of how the music and the sound and the picture are blended in this kind of crescendo of noise, essentially, some of which is tonal and choral and vocal, and some of which is electromagnetic.
But it's actually a representation of, there's a line in Naoki's book where he says to him the sound that the humming makes grows and becomes like a choir of angels. And that was one of the earliest experiments we did, where I recorded the human voice, and I think I layered it sort of 40, 45, 50 times. And in the theatre, we made it incredibly immersive, where we were taking different vowels. I was using the voice, the mouth, as a resonant cavity, and changing the wow, and changing the vowels as the scene progressed, and transporting you from the hum into this tonal and atonal choir at times. So
It's really magnificent. It really sounds so modern and like something, I don't know, like Rothko Chapel or something. And, by no, the composer escapes me. But yeah, and another thing about the film, I guess, that's so striking is the diversity of the palette in terms of the visual, but also most particularly in the sound, and how you have pieces that really are like these just so beautiful, very modern sounding music, and then you completely go into other modes and other textures and other cultural ideas. From that scene, I think it goes directly into India, if I'm not wrong, and there, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the introduction of Amrit.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the questions we had in the edit was, to what extent should we be intercutting all of these characters, or should we kind of think of the film more as a sort of multi-part film, a bit like actually the way Iraqi Fragments works, where you spend a lot of time with somewhere and with a group of people or a person, and then where you go next builds on that, even though it's with a completely different person. And I think when we sort of hit on that, the idea that the film shouldn't intercut people, which I think would have been a mistake, and should instead give them their individuality, they became more individual, and more. So Amrit, for example, Amrit is an artist. She began drawing when she was sort of 4 years old. She's nonverbal, really started to draw as a way of communicating her day to her mum. And that's now turned, she's now 22 or something, it's turned into this incredible art practice, where she's a very prolific creator of sort of paintings, and she's been very lucky. Her mum's a teacher, and the school's allowed her just to kind of live in the art room essentially of the school. So she's constantly making this work, which felt to me a way to take an audience, because she was a visual artist, just take an audience into a different way of seeing things. So it feels like the pattern of the film is that to begin with, you have to kind of immerse people in a different way of seeing things in detail, and then you can then that may become slightly overwhelming in Joss's sequence, like with the green boxes, and then you kind of emerge out sort of into society as the film progresses through Ben and Emma and their kind of political almost activities, and through Justina and her parents creating this school. So it has that sort of shape to it.
Yeah, it's interesting that the film does manage to be both high and low in a way. It's on one side, it has this activist kind of element, which you expect to see from maybe a more neurotypical film, but then also it has this whole perceptual, the idea of this whole creating all of these different, very diverse and different perceptual worlds through these really beautiful sequences of experiential little sequences. These, I don't know, how did you come up with this idea of like making these little islands of different sounding, different feeling pieces, because yeah.
Pass over to Nainita, but I think maybe one danger of Naoki's book people reading it is that you could generalize from it about, you know, the autistic experience, whatever that is, you know. But of course, I think as you see from the film, each of those people is completely sort of individual, even in the way their autism kind of impacts on their identity. And I suppose just the process of working on it, and I think Nainita would probably say the same in terms of musically, because so much of the making of the film was kind of following our noses, you know, it wasn't that kind of planned. It meant that the style of things often emerged out of the situations we were filming in, the people we were with, the things they noticed, the things they paid attention to, the things that were important to them. You know, I think that's probably true of music, isn't it?
And when you were filming things, I mean, there's, you know, some of the stuff is really, it looks like, you know, maybe the camera is on a dolly and, you know, the sort of the more fictional, dramatized sections of the film. But then also you have these sections that are really like observational verite material. And I'm wondering, you know, is all of that coming from you, or is some of it coming also from the producers? And what is the crew like when you're filming?
So the crew was always very small. Me, camera assistant, Ruben, who's the DOP, and a sound recordist. The sound recordist managed to hold down the whole 360, 16 tracks of audio all the time on her own, which was
Really
amazing feat, I have to say. So just the four of us. I think that, you know, we didn't. What we had, I suppose, was a method to approach each, which was really about, you know, how do we sense these spaces that we're in, and how can we then shoot to the things that we sense. So in Amrit's case, you know, she's in a high-rise block, kind of high above the edge of Delhi, 40-degree heat, and all of these fans are kind of going, and so, you know, we record 360-degree fan noise that goes to Nainita, who then develops fan ideas, and, you know.
And how do you do that? How do you, when you're recording, I mean, for Atmos, I mean, and this is kind of a question that I think might be, you know, your answer might be interesting to a lot of people who are interested in that format. For documentary, what is your approach from a technical standpoint? Are you using ambisonic microphones, or how?
So we had three mics basically. We had you know, a boom. I mean, it operated in a conventional way, but an ambisonic mic on the boom. So we had sort of back and sides on that. We had an ambisonic mic, which we would usually mainly in the end of the edit was used for the kind of bed of everything. You know, the sort of the Atmos, and we had a mic on the 360 mic on the camera, which actually we rarely use. I think it dug us out of a few holes in the edit, but we probably, there was so much handling noise on it. But the idea of doing that was that when perspective shift, we would have some kind of means of perspective. Right. And then Sarah Lima, who's the sound recordist, recorded sort of noise impact prints, is that the word, Nick, of every space we were in, and Nick could talk about that.
Oh, with a clicker.
Yeah, he recorded impulse responses.
Right. Yeah. Sure, that's really great. And then
because there isn't, I mean, this certainly for a documentary and many films, this is kind of very early, you know, techniques for capturing sort of in preparation for Atmos. But so there isn't a sort of gold standard yet, and we wanted to. I mean, my kind of background is.
You may have made it.
Yeah, I mean, we've basically. I've done a lot of spatial recording in the past, but I wanted us to leave as much flexibility as possible. So Jerry and I and Sarah, the sound recordist, sort of came up with this strategy for capturing as much sound as we could in the most sort of platform agnostic format. And what that ended up being was, you know, 16 tracks, which had to sort of remain in the edit in some way, which was very technically challenging for the editor and for Jerry to maintain all that time code all the time.
so basically you had everything sort of synchronized. You had a bunch of microphones, different devices, and they're all synced together. And then in the edit, you're also, along with the picture, keeping track of all of those 16
Yeah.
tracks in
I mean,
sync with the picture.
Yeah, exactly. Although I think as the edit progressed, tracks would get a lot. That sync, obviously, as soon as you layer up two lots of 16 tracks, you're in
Right.
real trouble.
Yeah.
And so we went through a process at the end of the edit where we just made sure we had one track from each recorder there, and then when we EDL'd out so we could go back to all the originals, so when we went back into the mix, we had everything. But there was like, I think 3/4 of a terabyte, 750 gigs of sound, which if anyone records sound, that's quite a lot of sound.
Yeah, tremendous amount. Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of, I wanted to mention a couple of things about these islands. This kind of, I really love that description you gave of these kind of islands of sensation. And one thing I would say is that, Nainita mentioned that we recorded impulse responses in every location. So the reverberance of every place that you see is used to kind of occasionally treat the music, but also treat some of the dialogue. And that gave rise to these kind of quadraphonic reverb presets that we created for each location. So that kind of immersed you in a kind of much more subliminal way. But the other thing I was going to mention is that a lot of the sound design is optical, by which I mean that it is sort of informed perceptually by the imagery that you're looking at. And that really kind of was a really important part of creating this sense of immersion. So when we're actually looking at a flower as it's floating in the water, we're using hyper detailed Foley and sound design, but we're also drawn to that sound by the image. So there's a real kind of intimate relationship, as there always is, between sound and image. But it was informed by the choice that Jerry made about what to film visually.
Yeah, it actually made me think a lot about the idea of synesthesia, that a color could have a sound, or a sound could have a color, or things like that. And
I have synesthesia.
I see.
A lot of my work is about synesthesia and about my experience of synesthesia, and a lot of autistic people are supposed to have kind of synesthetic sense. So there was a really nice kind of crossover there, I think.
Okay.
Spoken about a lot is this kind of multimodal overlap of experience.
Yeah, it's you really feel it watching the film that that there's a close association between the picture and what it sounds like, and it's not a direct. I mean, how do you even define that connection, right? But clearly, yeah, someone who is able to make that connection has designed the sound.
And often that, I mean, I think, Jerry, we had lots of conversations about what we could capture in each place that was sonorous. So you're often looking at things that make sound, and where there is there are phonetics of the image, which were were made possible by the choice of things to visualize. But where something that you're looking at doesn't make sound, the music is able to communicate the emotion of that image. So if there's something very, very still, ceiling fans make noise, but other things you see, like texture or fabric, doesn't necessarily make a sound, but it can make a texture, sort of a tonal texture, which Nainita was able to interpret as well. So we had this really nice relay between emotional depiction and sonification going on.
Yeah, it's really quite beautiful in the film.
something that we had to be very, very careful about how emotional to become. And, you know, we didn't want to feel sorry for the characters. And so the music had to tread this very fine line where initially I would write very perhaps rich or very emotional music to try and get across something in the scene emotionally, and in the mix we were paring things back and stripping things down and actually putting things in the space using the impulse responses, where for example we took Umrit in the exhibition space, which is this kind of a narrative spinal cord of the film, where we allow ourselves to have a bit of beauty in the music, and you hear the sound of the piano when you experience the beauty of her paintings. The music is quite emotive there, but we put the sound of the piano in the space of the exhibition, which kind of diffused the emotional aspect for me, I think, a little bit. And also in the forest, which is one of the pivotal moments in the film, talking about you know, the experiments, the genetic experiments that were going on, where the boy is wandering through the forest, and we were using the sound of the cellos interweaving through the boy wandering through the forest, and the cello is put in the space of the forest, and incidentally, the cellist in the film was autistic, so for me, authenticity and integrity to the subject matter was hugely important. So I brought in Elizabeth Wicklander, who's autistic herself, and so her contribution to the film was very personal and very sensitive. In, you know, when you heard the cello with Joss cupping his ears with the sound of the cellos and so on. So and you know, there are other moments like Justina, who we haven't touched upon, in Africa.
Right.
I actually use the sound. This is the instrument that I use, which is
yeah.
which is this kind of very, I think you touched upon it, the cultural references in the music. It sounds as though it comes from Africa, but it doesn't. Actually, it comes from Switzerland, this instrument. But it's just the sound of making that tone and that sound relate to the magic in her beads, and that's what it represented there. So having different instruments, having just the sound, putting it in the space, somehow sort of detracted you a little bit from becoming too over emotional with the music and relating it more to Nick's wonderful work and blurring the lines. You know, we're using rhythms at the beginning with Umrit sequence, where Jerry and Nick gave me these sound effects of the fans going round and round, and I used them in my early experiments of just chopping them up, editing them together, and creating this circular oscillatory rhythmical motion of music that then Nick then further developed, and you hear music and rhythms created from the location sounds in that scene, where you can't really sometimes tell what's what, and your attention is diverted to so many wonderful moments in the sink, where you hear the grating of the table fans going round and round, and that, I think that was a particularly successful sequence where we sort of fused the two together.
There are a lot of very successful sequences in the film, I have to say. I mean, it's really a captivating piece of work. And I think, you know, the challenge is, I guess, you know, having this subject matter, which isn't primarily story driven, but rather, you know, but rather perceptual, driven by perception. And but it's still, by the end of it, adds up to a film which really is about something in particular. As I said, it achieves both that kind of a political aspect, but also mostly it's a film which I think is really universal about the desire and the need to communicate and be understood, and to have people understand your world. and it's really, I think, an amazing achievement as a documentary. I think it's extremely, it just feels so ambitious in so many different ways, from the international scope of it to the experimental aspect of it, and the really, I think, groundbreaking work that you've done with the music and the sound together. I think it's really phenomenal and great. Thank you so much for the movie.
Thanks, James. Lovely words.
Cheers.